Welcome, everybody, to session 8 of Explorations into the Nature of Consciousness. So let me begin by sharing out my screen, and we will continue where we left off on page 104. This is really a summary of everything that we discussed during the previous 7 weeks. If any of you are watching this over the internet and haven't viewed the previous 7 sessions, I'm not sure how well you will be able to understand this presentation. But give it a try if some of you are experienced with analytic idealism or that new paradigm shift that moves us away from physicalism or materialism as it used to be called. So again, as I said before, this is part 8, which is really the conclusion, a summary, and a discussion of some of the major implications of the consciousness as fundamental paradigm, which seems to be emerging all over the place these days. So, as usual, I would like to begin with a 10-minute insight meditation to get everybody centered and focused on our own consciousness. It certainly helps to have that perspective when we're discussing many of the topics on this website. So first, a 10-minute presentation.
Allow yourself to get into whatever position feels most comfortable to you. And when you're ready, lovingly close your eyes. Invite your awareness to start to gather inwards, becoming the observer of your breath and body, just noticing without any judgment. And if judgment comes up, perhaps just saying, or I noticed that. And then continuing to simply be present with what is. Invite the breath to feel soft and natural, flowing as freely as it wishes, and yet still at a pace that somehow feels soft and gentle. Observing how both can be true at the same time. And on your next in-breath, now allow yourself to breathe in extra deeply, taking in that deep sip of air, holding it whenever you reach the top. And when you're ready, exhale with a sigh, really letting go in that exhale. And at the bottom of that deep exhalation, just allow the breath to go back to whatever pace was feeling so good to you. Affirm to yourself, I relax. I let go. I go within now. Tune into the weight of gravity. Intentionally allowing any muscles you do not need to use right now to become slack, to let gravity do its job. And as you feel your body releasing and relaxing more deeply, you flow deeper within. Trust where your awareness flows, whether it seems to go to your heart or your belly, perhaps your mid-torso. Find a space within you that feels really good for you to rest your awareness in. And now, spend just a few more breaths being completely present with this space and this space alone. Now find within this space a spark of light and enter within it. Notice how as you do, it appears as though you have entered into the vastness of the universe. It's as if that spark of light itself is the entire infinite nature of life itself. Is it possible infinity is within you? Feel your body respond with the lightness, signifying truth for you. Sense your awareness as vast as the universe. You may even feel as though your awareness is whooshing around, moving from one space to another, one galaxy to another, one nebula to another. Your awareness may be zipping around. Try not to hold on to it and let it flow. Recognize this feeling of how you can be everywhere at once. Is it possible the universe is within you? Breathe into a sense of lightness and how this feels. Honor your recognition. Affirm to yourself, I am that I am. And begin to become aware of the sensation that your human form, the one that you are currently connected to, the one you're experiencing life through. Feel how it exists within you. Affirming I am in me. With the I signifying the body and the me signifying how vast you truly are. If this were your universe, and I believe it is, would you make it? What would you choose? If all things are possible, and I believe they are, what would you choose? Feel the totality of you beyond your human form. Feel it gathering the resources that your human requires to be so fully expressed. To feel lit up, fully alive. You may stay in the energy of this practice for as long as you wish. And when you're ready to come out of this, do so by very slowly taking your time. Wiggle your fingers and toes. Open your eyes very slowly. And see your world with new eyes.
Well, welcome back, everybody. I always enjoy those meditations. It really helps me focus on my own consciousness and my relationship to the larger consciousness that we're a part of. Okay. What I'd like to do first is just sort of summarize what we covered last week. I will do it in a slightly different way. I find that explaining things in different ways or multiple ways can help really improve the understanding. I mean, this is a big topic. There's a lot of things to discuss with it, and we've really only scratched the higher level surface. We haven't gone into a lot of detail. That will come in a future class, and we can talk about it later, but what I'd like to suggest is that you consider taking one of the several courses that are available on the Essentia Foundation website for analytic idealism, and those are usually keynoted by Bernardo Castro himself. So here's my attempt at a summary of what we've been building to over the previous 7 weeks. Okay. As the title on the chart shows, or the slide, that consciousness is the fundamental aspect of all reality according to most consciousness ontologies. And in particular, there is only one consciousness, and that consciousness we call universal consciousness, cosmic consciousness, the source, God, or whatever other name you would like to use. I like to call it universal consciousness myself, and I usually refer to it as UC, for universal consciousness. And what is universal consciousness? It's pure phenomenal consciousness. It's beyond space and time. It exists everywhere and every when. It's pure experience or pure mentality. Another way to say it is pure subjectivity. And it also contains memory. So it has those two major aspects. all living creatures in our universe, all life, those with a brain and those without a brain, those on this planet or those on other planets within our galaxy or within some other galaxy, are all instances of a disassociation of that mentality from universal consciousness. Universal consciousness has mental archetypes, that's properties, propensities to operate in certain ways. And those universal archetypes are the basis for our objective reality and the laws of nature. Universal consciousness, since there's nothing external to it, only has the first person perspective. So when life forms through the disassociation of an aspect of universal consciousness, it still uses the scaffolding of universal consciousness, that is phenomenal consciousness and memory, as the basis for its consciousness. And all disassociated consciousness have two perspectives. They have the internal perspective, which is localized mentality, which is the first person perspective. It's the subjective world. It's the world of our experience. But it also has a third person perspective. That's the outside world, the objective world, what some might call physicality or objectality. But it's really a mental projection. Physical reality is a mental projection of that aspect of universal consciousness we called mind at large. It includes all aspects of universal consciousness except disassociated consciousness, in other words, life. That's a very important distinction to make, and we'll discuss that a little bit more in a minute. So, living creatures are organisms with brains, which evolved to survive in planetary ecosystems, can also assume higher levels of cognition, not necessarily available to universal consciousness. And these include things like self-reflection and metacognition, the ability to analyze, judge, evaluate, plan, using experience and memory, and to self-reflect on all those things. It does that through symbolic thinking, through objects of the mind. And I'd like to remind everybody that the dream analogy really helps here. When we go to sleep at night and when we dream, our minds create the entire dream. The dream avatar, the thing within the dream which we identify with, in other words, ourselves while we're sleeping, is one aspect of the dream. But the dreams that we have also have objects in them, things external to what the avatar can see: houses, cars, people, animals, trees, whatever else might be in the dream. So we don't recognize while we're dreaming that everything that takes place in our dream is really happening within our minds. And of course, when we wake up, we have the memories of the dreams, especially if we write them down, and especially if they had an emotional content to them. So we can remember our dreams in those cases. And we recognize that everything that we dreamt about, not only the dream avatar, but all the other objects in the dreams, the things external to the dream avatar, really took place in our minds. Okay. And again, the last bullet point on the slide, our minds are really the disassociated consciousness from universal consciousness that uses universal consciousness as scaffolding as the mechanism for how it can be conscious in its own right, with the additional ability to assume higher levels of cognition. Now, when we see the world, uh, the external world, that's objectivity. If I was a brain surgeon and I opened somebody's skull, I would be seeing not their mentality, but the third person perspective of that mentality, which would look like a brain, just like within our dreams. So physicality has all the appearances and properties that we come to believe is what makes up our reality, but it's all taking place in consciousness. Um, so, in that regard, if you look at the bottom of the slide, consciousness does not really exist within us. We, our physical bodies, our mentality or subjectivity, whatever you want to call it, all that exists in universal consciousness, just as all the objects in our dreams do. Now, when universal consciousness dissociates and creates local consciousness, and of course, as I indicated in a previous session, we know that this occurs in human beings and the people with dissociative identity disorder or what used to be called multiple personality disorders. So it can happen in nature for sure. Um, in the boundary between disassociated consciousnesses and the universal consciousness, like everything in nature, is porous. And in some cases, information can leak across the boundaries of the disassociation. And this explains all kind of phenomena that have no explanation in materialism or physicality. For example, when I have a strong emotional bond with another person, another dissociated consciousness, um, information can leak across the boundary between those two local consciousness, and you can pick up information that's not available in ordinary reality. And there are even techniques that can be used to make that boundary a little bit more porous, um, that so you can develop those abilities. It also explains how information can leak across the boundary between our local consciousness and the universal consciousness. And that would explain near-death experiences, for example, or some many other psi phenomena like telepathy, or even the savant syndrome that we talked about, terminal lucidity, and all the other things that we've discussed in the past. So the porosity of the boundaries can be enhanced through techniques that create coherence or resonance between those different dissociated consciousness and the universal consciousness. So just to summarize, cosmic consciousness, universal consciousness, source, God, whatever you want to call it, has two aspects. The fundamental experiential aspect, the pure subjectivity, and then it has the disassociated aspect of all living creatures throughout the entire universe. That aspect of what we as local consciousness consider objective reality is really an aspect of the universal consciousness, which we call mind at large, which includes everything but disassociated consciousness for all forms of life. Think to the dream analogy again. All the objects in our dream, aside from the dream avatar, are really take place in the mind of the dreamer. Well, universal consciousness does the same thing for our reality. It's what creates physicality. It's why the moon doesn't disappear when you stop looking at it. Because, like all objects that are not living, the perception of those objects is really a mental construct within the universal mind, that aspect of it called mind at large. Okay, I think that pretty much covered it. I might go over this in a little bit more detail, but again, this is a summary. I'd like to move on so we can discuss some of the implications of consciousness as this fundamental aspect of reality. Okay, one thing that I would like to point out, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, if I was a brain surgeon and I opened somebody's skull and looked inside, I would not see their mentality, their subjectivity. I would see what looks like the third person perspective. I would see their brain, their neurons, the interconnection, the synapses, the dendrites, the axons. And, if I had the appropriate sensory perception mechanisms, all the electrochemical activity and signaling that take place across the neurons within the brain. Well, it's kind of interesting that astrophysicists have done simulations of the very largest scales of our entire universe. And I have two pictures here. The picture on the left is the neural network, I believe, from a rat. The picture on the right is the one that was the result of the simulation of what the universe at large might look like from the very largest scale. And one of the things that is really striking is that from a human being's perspective, a disassociated consciousness from universal consciousness or a local consciousness, whatever you want to call it, we see everything outside our mentality from a third person perspective. And guess what? The universe on the largest scale size looks like a neural network. Now, that's very interesting. However, it seems to make a lot of sense if reality is really all a mental phenomena. So that's why I'm presenting this chart. Okay. We've discussed everything on this chart before. It's basically how our external and internal, endogenous and exogenous activities of mind filter everything. And this is very important because we don't see reality as it is, we see reality as we are. If we could see reality as it is, as the universal mind sees it, we would have such an incredible overload that the energy required to process all that information would literally destroy our mind. As Bernardo Castro likes to describe it, our our brains would become soup, because the energy dissipation from processing all that information would be so overwhelming. It's way beyond the ability of the brain to take it into account. So we only see information that's necessary for us to survive and thrive in a planetary ecosystem. We do not see reality the way it really is. So we don't have to worry about the incredible entropy or heat dissipation that would take place if we could perceive all of reality the way universal mind sees it. So Okay. I already talked about porosity. Nothing in nature is perfect, and we've talked about this before. And information that are not normally available to our mental functions sometimes can leak us across the dissociative boundaries, because those boundaries become somewhat porous, especially when we're in a very coherent state, or there's a strong bond, like a strong emotions between disassociated consciousnesses. So when those information leaks occur, that's what gives rise to these extraordinary abilities and experiences. The disassociation is a crucial part of the metaphysics of idealism. I have a great presentation here, a video that's about 20 minutes long that was put together by Bernardo Kastrup, and it's available on the Essentia Foundation website. So again, it's Essentia Foundation, all one word, .org. Well, you can see it in the lower right-hand corner. That's the website. So this particular video can be found on that website. But let's watch the video. You may not grasp everything, but you have the background to understand most of what he's talking about. It also includes a little bit of review, which I think is good because there's a lot to digest over these last 8 weeks. And I think this will help clarify a lot of issues or questions from the entire 8-week class. So here we go.
Yeah, I'm sorry I couldn't be there joining you today. I will do my best here from my study.
You hear that okay?
I'll talk about IIT, Information Integration Theory, under the framework of analytic idealism, which is a consciousness-only ontology, unlike mainstream physicalism or materialism. In 10 minutes, I will not be able to argue why I think analytic idealism is right and materialism is wrong. It's just too short time to do that. What I would do is I will very briefly tell you what analytic idealism is, how it differs from materialism, and then how we can interpret IIT or integrated information theory under the framework of analytic idealism. I will not even tell you directly what IIT is, but you will be able to pick up the smell of it. It will be in between the lines, so to say. All right, so let's start with mainstream physicalism or materialism. Under physicalism, when you perceive a basketball, you perceive those qualities like the colors orange and black, or even the texture and the smell of a basketball. All of those qualities are supposed to be generated by your brain inside your skull. We do not know how that happens. Physicalists do not put forward even a coherent hypothesis for how the brain could possibly operate this kind of magic. But that's the presupposition of that metaphysics, that qualities are generated by your brain inside your skull, and they only exist inside your skull. Now, there is something that corresponds to the ball that you see bouncing off in the real world outside, and that something is supposed to be made of atoms that take on a spherical shape. They arrange themselves in a way that the geometrical relationships between them are spherical, just like the ball that you actually perceive is spherical. So under materialism, although the world out there has no qualities, has no colors, the contours that we perceive on the screen of perception are supposed to be the actual contours of the world. If there is a basketball bouncing in your perception, then there is something spherical bouncing in the real world outside. But that something in the real world has no intrinsic qualities. It has no color, has no taste, has no flavor, no smell, has no melody, has no texture. If you provide a complete list of the correct quantities or numbers, you will have said everything there is to say about the real basketball in the world outside. It's purely quantitative and purely abstract. You cannot even visualize it. But through your perceptual organs, by emitting photons, for instance, that abstract thing bouncing outside modulates how your brain generates the qualities that you associate with the basketball on the screen of perception. So that's physicalism. Under physicalism, the very same thing applies to a skyline. There are only the contours of the skyline in the real world outside. It has no colors, it has no qualities. It only has geometrical relationships that are reflected on what you do perceive in the screen of perception, which your brain will then fill in with colors, fill in with qualities, the qualities of experience. And of course, insofar as the brain is a physical object, then the brain too is supposed to exist just as a sort of an abstract outline, an abstract set of contours and geometrical relationships that when perceived by your brain, when your brain perceives itself or the brain of another person, then your brain will somehow generate the colors, the flavors, the smells, the textures that we associate with the organ called the brain. So that's mainstream physicalism. Now, how does analytic idealism differ from this? Under analytic idealism, nature is constituted only of mental states, qualitative states. There are no purely quantitative states. Under analytic idealism, these purely quantitative states are a pure theoretical abstraction of materialism, and we don't need it. It's inflationary. We don't need that kind of abstraction to make sense of nature. We can make sense of nature purely on experiential states, mental states. And these mental states, represented by the vertices in this graph, they embody certain qualities, like the color red, or the bitterness of disappointment, or the taste of strawberries, and so on and so forth. And they can be linked together via associative links. The quality of a memory can bring you to a certain thought. That thought can evoke a certain emotion, which can then evoke other memories. So there are associative links between, across mental states. And different mental states can be more or less integrated. For instance, these two mental states here are dissociated from one another. There is no path in this graph that can take you from one of these mental states to the other one. So they are dissociated. The others are associated. They are cognitively associated together. They evoke one another. And this is what we are. Our conscious inner life is this. It's a set of mental states, some corresponding to memories, others corresponding to feelings, others to emotions, fantasies, perceptual qualities, and so on and so forth. And they can be more or less associated together. And when those associations form reentrant loops like this, then those loops integrate a lot of information, and they can lead to metacognition. In other words, they can lead to a thought about another thought, or a thought about a feeling, when mind sort of turns in upon itself and inspects its own contents. Jonathan Schooler is going, I don't know whether he's going to talk about this, but he produced one of the seminal papers on this notion of conscious metacognition or metaconsciousness over 20 years ago. So this is what we are under analytic idealism. We have these internal cognitive states, these internal cognitive representations. But representations of what? For instance, when we have the image inside our minds of a city skyline full of qualities, that's a graph connecting qualities together, the colors, the shapes, the feeling of the wind, the smells of the city. But if these are internal representations, what do they then represent if there is no external physical world? Well, there is no external physical world under analytic idealism, but there is an external world, and it is also constituted of mental states. Not my mental states, not your mental states, but mental states at large. Think of it as you think of my thoughts right now. My thoughts, from your perspective, are external. They are external to you. You cannot think my thoughts. You cannot change my thoughts merely by wishing them to be different. And my thoughts would still be here even if you were not there. So from your perspective, my thoughts are objective and external, but from their own perspective, they are subjective. They are mental. They are experiential. In exactly the same way, the idea is that there is a real external world beyond our individual minds, but it too is mental. It too is constituted of mental states, but mental states outside our individual minds. We are dissociated from the mental states that constitute the external world, just like we can have internal dissociated mental states as well. There is a condition when dissociation is severe. It's called dissociative identity disorder in the DSM-5. It used to be called multiple personality disorder, I think up to DSM-3 or 4. So there are external states, they are also mental. Now, between us and the world, by the way, we do not know what it is like to have those mental states that constitute the world. To know that, you would have to be the world, but you are not. You are you, and I am me. So we do not know directly what it feels like to be the world. We just know that there is something that it feels like to be the world because it's constituted of mental states. Now, between us and the world, there is another set of intermediary states. And these states are such that they can be influenced by the external states of the world, and they can influence the external states of the world. They can also influence our internal cognitive states, and they can be influenced by our internal cognitive states. So in mathematics, we can model this as a Markov blanket, which is a set of states that form a kind of a blanket that isolate the internal states from the external states, but permit them to communicate with one another via proxy, the proxy being these intermediary states of the Markov blanket. Now, the hypothesis here is that what we colloquially call the physical world is the states in the Markov blanket. It's not the actual real states in the world out there. The physical world, physical in the colloquial sense, the stuff we see, hear, touch, smell, taste, this stuff corresponds to the states of the blanket that surrounds us as individual mental agents. In this case here, I'm illustrating those states as having the qualities of pixels, the qualities of colors, if it corresponds to vision. And once we lay an interpretation on those pixels, if we interpret those pixels, we can identify clouds, we can identify buildings, and that's what perception is. It's an interpretation of sensory states, an interpretation of the states of the Markov blanket. And the physical world, physicality, resides only in the Markov blanket under analytic idealism. There is an external world, but it's not physical in the sense of not being exhaustively describable through a list of quantities. It is fundamentally qualitative, not made of the qualities of perception, because those qualities are here in the Markov blanket. It's made of other qualities inaccessible to us, interrogation marks, which in turn modulate the qualities that we can access in the Markov blanket. That's the idea. So we still have an external world that is objective from our perspective, but that external world isn't physical, and it is fundamentally qualitative. So there is no need to go from something that is fundamentally non-experiential to experience, which is the hard problem of consciousness. Here you don't have that. Here you only have qualities modulating other qualities, which is trivial. Just think of your thoughts modulating your emotions, or your emotions modulating your thoughts. It happens every day. It's entirely trivial. Now, what about when there are two people, when there are two individual minds? So there is one individual mind here, and there is another individual mind here. So this second individual mind can influence the states of its Markov blanket by moving their limbs, for instance, or speaking, causing air oscillations. And those states of the Markov blanket can influence external states, which through a chain of causative links can in turn influence the states of the Markov blanket of someone else, which can then modulate someone else's internal cognitive states. What does this person here see when this chain of causation happens? well, what this person will see is someone else. The idea is that the physical body is what these states that correspond to someone else's inner life, conscious inner life, mental states, look like. The body is what our inner mental states look like when observed from across at least one Markov blanket, in this case, 2. And of course, if you crack somebody else's skull open and you have a look inside, you see a brain which correlates with the experience, correlates very well with the experience. Why does it do so? Well, because the brain is part of the body. The brain, too, is what someone's inner cognitive states look like when observed from across a Markov blanket or a dissociative boundary. So, of course, they correlate. The brain is the image of our inner experiential states. So obviously, it correlates with our inner experiential states. There is no surprise there. And in all of this, we preserve causality, we preserve science, we preserve physics, we preserve an external world, but we avoid the hard problem altogether because there is no need for that impossible bridge between something non-experiential and something experiential. So let me repeat this for emphasis. Under analytic idealism, the living brain is what inner mental states look like from a perspective, from across a Markov blanket. The brain is not what generates those mental states. The brain is just the extrinsic appearance of those inner experiential states, and therefore there are tight correlations between one and the other. To use another metaphor, think of the physical world as what appears on a dashboard of dials, like an airplane making measurements of the states of the sky outside. Those measurements are presented to the pilots of the airplane in the form of dial indications on a dashboard. So the indications on the dashboard correlate with the actual states of the sky. If they didn't, the dashboard wouldn't be useful. It certainly wouldn't be reliable. So of course, there is a correlation link there. The dashboard does accurately convey salient information about the external states of the sky. It's made for that. But the dashboard isn't the sky. And that's the error we make when we take the physical world for the real world out there. We are taking the dashboard for the sky. The problem is that we are like pilots who were born inside an airplane cockpit, and that airplane has no windows. All we have ever had is the dashboard. So we very naturally mistake the dashboard for the sky outside because we don't have a direct way to access the sky outside. Thank goodness, because if we had, we would literally melt into goulash soup because there is no upper bound to the entropy of the states of the world. But there must be an upper bound to the entropy of our inner states. Otherwise, we wouldn't maintain our structural integrity. What creates that upper bound is precisely the fact that our inner cognitive states don't mirror the states of the world. If they did, we would have a transparent windshield to see the world as it actually is. But we can't have that. We would die. So instead, our inner cognitive states represent the states of the outside world in an inferential, encoded manner that limits our internal entropy and favors prompt reaction to environmental challenges and opportunities. There's a lot of game theory behind that as well that maybe Don and Hoffman will talk about today. So in a nutshell, under analytic idealism, these two circles here are what we are. We are a set R of inner cognitive states. We have certain states that correspond to our Markov blanket. When our Markov blanket is represented on a dashboard, it will look like our skin, retinas, eardrums, surface of the tongue, lining of the nose. These states can be sensory states, collecting information this way, or they can be active states influencing the world through the Markov blanket. You do that when you move your limbs and you perform work in the world. Now, what about when there are many people together? Well, when there are many people together, this is what we have. We have the world as it is in itself, a set of states, psi, and the physical world that you have is your own. It's unique to you. My physical world is unique to me. Your physical world is your dashboard representation of phi. My physical world is my dashboard representation of phi. You have your dashboard, I have mine. Someone else has another physical world, another dashboard. Now, your dashboard indications are consistent with mine. If you were here in my study, you would describe it in a way entirely consistent with my own description. What does that say? It doesn't say that your physical world is the same as mine. They aren't. You never see the world from my perspective. You will have to occupy the same volume that I occupy. What's going on is that your dashboard is showing representations of the same set of states psi that my dashboard is representing. So the two representations are consistent because they are both representing the same thing, but that thing isn't physical. It isn't exhaustively describable through a set of numbers. That's the idea. The world out there is mental. Physicality is a dashboard representation of transpersonal mentation. Finally, integrated information theory. I'm almost through. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but you will smell it. You catch it in between the lines. Our brain has physical states. We can call it brain metabolism, brain activity. When neurotransmitters are released across a synaptic cleft, these are dynamic physical states that can be measured. And when we measure them, we get a sort of a picture of brain activity. This can be PET scan, fMRI, MEG, EEG, whatever. We have measurable physical states on one side. On the other side, we can introspect into our own mentation. We can describe what it feels like to be us, what it feels like to have, to experience a fantasy, to taste an apple, to experience the bitterness of heartbreak. We have introspective access to our internal mental state. And we know that one corresponds to the other because physicality, this, is a dashboard representation of mentation, this. So of course they correspond to one another. The dashboard represents the state of the sky, they correlate. What IIT is trying to do, interpreted in the way I'm proposing, is to create a bijective mapping between these two sets, between measurable physical states, states of the brain, and introspectively reportable inner mental states. By creating this bijective mapping, maybe it's not entirely bijective. Even if it's not, it's still very useful. But in the ideal case, it's bijective. By trying to figure out what this function is, this bijective function that links one to the other, we can gain tremendous insight into our own mentation. Why? Because we know we cannot introspect into everything that is relevant about our mentation. If we could, therapists would lose their jobs. You would never go to a therapist. You'd never go to a psychologist because you would know what's going on with you. Introspection is very shallow. It doesn't go deep. By creating this bijective mapping, we can gain much deeper insight into what is actually going on with us. In cases of pathology, this mapping is all we would have. We cannot introspect into the low-level physiology. In other words, the raw experience of what it means to be human. Evolution has prevented us from gaining introspective access into that because it's an invariable. It doesn't change. We don't need to be explicitly aware of that to survive. All right, once this bijective mapping is created and calibrated based on introspection, we can extrapolate it not only into what is, in my view, wrongly called the human unconscious or the subconscious, we can extrapolate it further because you see, our brain is made of the same kinds of atoms and force fields as the rest of the universe. If the physical brain is what inner mentation looks like, and the rest of the universe is made of the same kind of stuff as the physical brain, then the rest of the universe too is the extrinsic appearance, the dashboard representation of mental dynamics, transpersonal mental dynamics. So if we have this bijective mapping calibrated for the brain, we possibly can also extrapolate it beyond just the brain. So when we have a city or a galaxy or a moon or whatever, that too is a dashboard representation of mental states. We can extrapolate the bijective mapping and try to have some degree of insight into the noumena, into what it is like to be the world, the inanimate cosmos out there. And in Kantian terminology, that could mean that IIT could offer us the first attempt at a theory of the noumena, a theory of the thing in itself, as opposed to a theory of the phenomena, a theory of how the thing in itself presents itself to us in perception, a theory of the dynamics of the dashboard. And that's what physics is. Physics is a theory of the dynamics of the dashboard, because physics is fundamentally anchored in perception. Even if we use instruments like telescopes and microscopes, we need to perceive the output of those instruments. So everything gets filtered out through the dashboard. IIT offers us a possibility to go beyond the dashboard, in my view. Now, just a final thought. This is a micrograph of the cerebellum, part of the brain. And this image is produced through a very careful simulation of the structure of the universe at its largest scales, which we call the cosmic web in cosmology. And it is uncanny how similar they are, how the structure of the universe at its largest scales is akin to the structure of a brain, despite completely different scales and principles of operation. And this is not just visual. You can actually quantify this by doing a spatial Fourier transform on the cosmic web, on some control phenomena that have nothing to do with what we are talking about, like clouds, tree branches, plasma, and water turbulence. And we can compare the results. And if you look at the cosmic web in red, it tracks with the structure of the cerebellum at the lower ends of the scale. Surprisingly well, the controls in green don't track well at all. But the cosmic web and the cerebellum track very well at the lower ends, and at the highest ends, the cosmic web tracks exquisitely well with the cortex. So maybe we are not far off in postulating that we could apply IIT to the cosmos, because, you know, at the end of the day, the cosmos looks like a brain as well. I'll leave it here. Thanks for your time and attention.
I know that's a lot to take in, and it might be worthwhile watching the recording again a few times. You have the background now to understand most of what he's talking about. So these Markov blankets basically are like the dashboard in an airplane. It corresponds to what reality really is, but of a limited form of it. Because if it didn't, we would be so overwhelmed by the huge amount of information from actual reality that our brains would turn to mush. You know, the more information you process in a given unit of time, the more energy has to be expended. And that's why the brain would turn to mush. It would be such an overload. We'd spend so much time analyzing the incoming information, we wouldn't be able to react to it or figure out what to do about the information that was brought in. So IIT provides a model for the disassociation, which is really the Markov blanket, which limits the information that comes in from the external world, which is purely mental. But, you know, the key point to remember, it is the limitation that allows us to survive and thrive on a planetary ecosystem, you know, without getting overloaded with all the information that we would have to have if we perceive reality the way it actually was. So the way I look at the Markov blanket, it's what allows disassociation to happen. And sometimes if the Markov blanket states line up with our internal states and the external states, information leaks through the porous boundary. And that's when we experience what ultimate reality is really like, what universal consciousness is really like. We get glimpses of eternity or universal consciousness, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
So anyways, that's a lot to take in. And you really need to think about it and watch it a couple times before it really all sinks in.
So reality out there is mental, not your mentality or my mentality or anybody else's mentality or any other living creature's mentality. We're all disassociated from each other. But we are seeing glimpses of the universal consciousness's mentality, cosmic consciousness, if you will. And as this slide says, the fundamental substrate of all reality is that there is only one universal or subjective consciousness. So everything is either conscious, either disassociated from other consciousness, or exists within consciousness. Physical objects, including when you open someone's skull and look at their brain. That's what physicality looks like from a third-person point of view. What it feels like is the mental images you experience from the first-person perspective or from a pure subjectivity point of view. So all life is dissociated aspects of universal consciousness, specifically phenomenal consciousness, are that subjectivity, what things feel like from that first person perspective. Okay, so space and time are mental constructs that organize experience. For cosmic consciousness, space and time are unbounded. They don't really exist. So therefore, consciousness is unbounded, which means it's eternal and immortal. And consciousness is what assigns meaning to all experience through the information that comes across the Markov blanket or through the disassociated boundary, that porous boundary. So in this view, this metaphysical view, there's only oneness. There is only one thing, and it has causal powers. It is self-excitable. It exists for itself as well as others. In other words, it can change its internal states itself or external states, which is something, a physical object, what we think of as physical objects, cannot do. They don't exist for themselves. So Sir James Jean, a physicist from the UK, has said earlier in the 20th century, the more you look at the universe, the more it seems like a great thought as opposed to a physical reality. So quantum physicists in particular have been saying this for almost 100 years. So I'm not going to go through the empirical evidence as to why the latest discoveries in the last 100 years in quantum physics, in the neurosciences and biology and medicine all point to a mental reality, not a physical one. We've covered a lot of that in previous sessions. But the metaphysical point of view of idealism has tremendous explanatory power. A lot of the things that physicalism denies can even exist, like psi phenomena, synchronicities, near-death experiences, and all the rest of it, can be explained so simply as information leaking through the Markov blanket or the disassociated consciousness from, the difference between my consciousness and universal consciousness. So I highly recommend, by the way, there's great videos, articles, audio files at the Essentia Foundation. And it seems to be, I don't know how many people they have affiliated with it, but scientists and philosophers and others from all kinds of disciplines are constantly contributing videos and articles and papers to the Essentia Foundation. Wonderful place to go to find out what the latest research is saying about all this. Okay, so the old saying, the one is in the many and the many is in the one, certainly seems like it's true. Oneness is all there is in this metaphysics. And we exist within universal consciousness as disassociated local consciousness from the universal consciousness. And that cosmic mentality makes up everything. And everything that we experience from a third person perspective, any objects in the outside world, are really constructs in the mind at large, that aspect of universal consciousness that's not living, creating living entities that are disassociated from the universal consciousness. It's what's non-living, the so-called physical world. So, all this raises a very interesting philosophical question. Why is there something and not nothing if there's only one consciousness? So this is another 10 or 15-minute video by Bernardo that I think is very interesting and offers a lot of food for thought. But before I show this, do you have any, immediate questions, or do you want to just let this percolate and sink in for a while?
Let it percolate.
Okay, yeah, it's a lot to take in. This is a whole graduate level curriculum on the nature of consciousness. So let's watch this other video. I think you'll find it interesting also.
My point to you is that although this is culturally incredibly counterintuitive, it is metaphysically completely coherent. There is nothing incoherent about this idea that the drive to all expression, including artistic expression, is whatever emptiness feels that it must do. Because that emptiness is subjectivity. So it's not nothing. It is empty of form, but it is pregnant with all possible forms. Just like a dancer is pregnant with all possible choreographies, or a lake is pregnant with all possible ripples. So it is not an absence of all. On the contrary, it is the ultimate pregnancy. The emptiness is pregnant with all that there can ever be. Now, why does it then express it? Why does it then give birth? Because it could remain just happily pregnant, right? Then I think that's the core of your question. Why is it doing anything? Why does it choose to do anything to put itself through this shit show that we call life? Why does it do that? Is it a masochist? Is it some form of self-punishment? No, I'm a naturalist. I don't think this stuff is happening deliberately. I think what this betrays, in the sense of revealing, I think what this reveals is that the state of absolute rest is not sufficient for emptiness. If it were, there would be nothing. There is some excitation, self-excitation of subjectivity that in some way makes it uncomfortable enough that it seeks to change its state. And the moment it seeks to do that, it's already expressing, it's already doing the dance, it's already doing something. And bing, boom, big bang, stars, galaxies, planets, and monkeys running around planets. That's what you then immediately get. That's why, and we discussed this a couple of weeks ago, I think, that's why I do not think that the primordial state of nature in which emptiness is not dancing, I don't think that's a state of complete self-sufficiency. Because if it were, we wouldn't be here. Nothing would be happening. And what is not there that is sensed and intuited and therefore sought after, which leads then to the dance, is what I refer to in my latest book as the primordial lack. And I think many meditators, when they achieve a certain state that may be described as peace profound, nirvana, in Hinduism it has another name, which escapes me now. They feel that's a state of total self-sufficiency because of a matter of contrast. Human beings are in a perennial state of lack and discomfort, we're desperately trying to make ourselves happy, which is, by the way, impossible. But we keep on trying. We don't know to play the game in any other way. And when you finally stop that and you find some degree of peace, the contrast is so overwhelming that you rush to the conclusion that therefore nature in its primordial state is completely content. I don't think that is the case. I think if you would stay as a living being in a state of nirvana, I would say 10 years, but I'm tempted to say 1 week. But let me play safe. If you stay in nirvana for 10 years, then after that, come back to me and say whether you were truly, really, completely content for 10 years, or whether there was a cosmic itch right there, that tiny, subtle little thing that compared to the shit show of human life is nothing. It doesn't compare to the tremendous suffering we go through in this state. So it sort of falls from view. It's not even in the noise. But if you are only in the presence of that and nothing else for 10 years, come back and tell me if you think that the primordial state of nature really is of complete self-sufficiency. So that's the experiential avenue. But I will argue this to you based on an analytic idea. If there is only a field of subjectivity, clearly it is not comfortable being in a state of rest. Look around. That's the empirical proof. It's not at rest. It's desperately doing a dance. Whether it's a victory dance or some other kind of gig, I don't know. But it's desperately doing something, and it seems incapable of stopping. And I think it is coherent to say that that's an internal impulse towards self-excitation. It doesn't come from the outside. It doesn't have an external trigger because there's nothing outside of it. It is the sum total of what there is. And this isn't incoherent. We feel all the time triggers and drives from within, not prompts from the world, but stuff that arises in us out of a sort of self-excitation. And it compels us to act and do something and change our state and the state of the world in some way. So this idea of an inner drive that is natural, intrinsic, and inevitable, it isn't incoherent with talk of the ultimate level of existence being empty. Because even emptiness, if it has dispositional states, in other words, if it has the tendency to act in a certain way as opposed to other ways, those tendencies are archetypal, right? And that's what Jung referred to as archetypes, the basic templates of mind to behave, to act, to wish, to desire, to fear, and so on. If there is only one field of subjectivity, then the archetypes apply to that because it means one natural universal mind. One of those archetypes is a template of discomfort. And I think that's an empirical necessity if we agree with all the rest of the rationale for idealism, a form of objective idealism. If we agree with all the rest of the rationale on its own basis, then we must face the implication, which is that this universal mind, in a very deep archetypal level, does not regard a state of absolute rest as sufficient. It seeks to express itself through the mirror of experience. That's what Olivier was talking about earlier, that the artistic expression is a mirroring of the empty state within. Somehow, this mirroring of our inner potentiality on the mirror of experience seems to be sensed as a path to fulfillment. Traditionally, this has been called the impulse to self-knowledge, because you can only know yourself by expressing yourself and regarding your own self-expression in some context, right? So how do you know which notes are played by the guitar string, right? Because the note a guitar string naturally produces, scientifically speaking, can tell you how long it is, what is the elasticity of the guitar string, how much mass it has over its length, because these parameters determine what are the natural frequencies or the harmonics under which the guitar string will vibrate if it's excited. So there is a sense in which this field of subjectivity can only know itself by plucking itself and observing the notes, so it sort of can try to intuitively reconstruct what it is. Because if it doesn't do that, if it doesn't express itself, it's like the guitar string that doesn't play a note. It can't know itself because in itself, it's empty. There's nothing discernible there, right? And it needs to dance. Emptiness needs to dance. And it is by observing the choreography on this mirror of experience that it can intuitively, I'm going to anthropomorphize it because I have no other recourse, but keep in mind that anthropomorphization is an error. It seeks to infer its own characteristics by observing its own dance, by listening to it, to the notes it produces when it plucks itself.
Practicing. Practicing itself, discovering itself.
Expressing itself, yeah. And if it doesn't do that, there is no way for it to infer anything about itself because it is emptiness. Emptiness at rest is emptiness. It's just a pregnancy of everything, but not an expression of anything. I think that is the cosmic itch. I think that is the primordial lack. It's this intuitive, intrinsic, irresistible desire, very, very spontaneous, not deliberate, not thought through, very spontaneous desire to figure out what it is. And if that pops once, even if mildly, there is no stopping it. It builds on its own momentum and boom, Big Bang, galaxies, quasars, black holes, planets, and monkeys running around. And here we are.
Thank you.
That's my intuition about it, Jasper.
Yeah, fine. It's good.
My point to you is that
I'm going to stop there. I guess, what he's really saying is we are the universe's way of knowing itself. We're a result of that process. So, this is a summary. Physicalism is the prevailing view, and there's less and less arguments, and more people are recognizing that physicalism doesn't describe the reality that we live in. And analytic idealism is the emerging view that seems to fit the entire spectrum of human experience. And it has all kinds of implications on how we need to live our lives, in a different way, not in the pursuit of material possessions, but in spiritual pursuits instead. I'm not going to go into this in more detail. I think you can read this for yourself. One interesting thing that I will point out is that we talked about before that memory is not in the brain. The access circuit to memory is. And what is learned and experienced over a lifetime is never lost. It becomes part of the cosmic conscious experience over the life of the universe. And that has all kinds of implications for what it means about survival of some aspect of our consciousness when bodily death occurs. So Chris Beisch is a fellow at the Institute of Noetic Science. He, for many years, I believe, was a professor at a college or university in Ohio. And he personally experienced and went on many, many trips over a 20-year period. We're using psychedelics and very intense, extensive experience he had. And as a result of all his experiences, he wrote a book about him. And this was a quote that he sent us recently. one of the founders of Noetic Science is going to interview him, and will be a video on put up on our YouTube channel. But I think this statement is very interesting. Let me just read it. That the universe is the manifest body of a divine being of unimaginable intelligence, compassion, clarity, and power. That we are all aspects of this being, never separated from it for a moment. That we are growing ever more aware of this connection. That physical reality emerges out of light and returns to light continuously. That light is our essential nature and our destiny. That all life moves as one. That reincarnation is true. That there is a deep logic and significance to the circumstances of our lives. That everything we do contributes to the evolution of the whole. That our awareness continues in an ocean of time and a sea of bliss when we die. That we are loved beyond measure. That humanity is driven towards an evolutionary breakthrough that will change us and life on this planet at the deepest level. This is all very consistent with what you just heard from Bernardo, which is a much more scientific perspective on this same thing. So this is sort of a summary. The ontological primitive of the universe, in other words, the base level of reality. There is only oneness. That oneness is mental, and it is what space, time, and matter come from. It is boundless with immense potential. Whatever cosmic itch it has, as Bernardo just said in that video, it has the potential to create it. And that universal consciousness is learning and evolving to satisfy its needs, desires, and inherent archetypes, its own cosmic itch. It is a universe that learns by trial and error. It's self-organizing. It's intelligent in that it assigns meaning to information. It's highly creative. It's interactive and participatory. It's agential. It exists for itself. It has causal power to affect itself and everything it dreams up. And through life, which is disassociated, complex from the universal self, consciousness is learning about itself. And that all knowledge and experience gained from that, all those disassociated complex, is never lost, even when that disassociated life ends. So this is what the mystics have been saying for 3,500 years from the Far East in the Indus Valley, in India and Pakistan and Afghanistan and places like that. Science is now catching up to what these ancient mystical traditions have been saying for at least the last 3,500 years. And Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo 14 astronaut who founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences, has this wonderful saying, which I think basically sort of describes the whole thing. God sleeps in the minerals, awakens in plants, walks in animals, and thinks in mankind, or humankind, I guess is more appropriate these days. So that's it. We pretty much covered everything that I wanted to cover. I mean, I know it's a lot. Like I said, there's so many subjects that we could go into much deeper. It takes a while for this all to sink in. It's not something that you're going to grasp everything in its entirety immediately. It requires a lot of self-reflection and thought. And anyways, I hope you found this useful and helpful. And I encourage you to look at some of the books written by and papers written by the people or the organizations that are mentioned on this page. a lot of research going on now, and all of it is totally consistent with this consciousness as fundamental in the universe as opposed to physicality. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Bob. I appreciate you putting all of this together and taking the time to lay it out. And I appreciate the further information listing you have at the end. I went ahead and got the analytical idealism in a nutshell that you suggested. And very, very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and there's so many great books, so much great information. I try to exercise every day. I usually go for a walk in the park, in the natural area on one part of the park. And it takes me about, an hour and a half if I walk all the trails. I usually do it for an hour to an hour and a half. I have recorded many, many YouTube sessions by the people mentioned on this slide. And let me stop sharing. Anyways, so I have listened to a lot of these sessions as I walk through the park over a long period of time. Of course, I worked with Edgar Mitchell for many years, starting in the early 1980s, on trying to understand the nature of consciousness and what it was all about. Things have evolved a lot in the last 20 or 30 years, and they're picking up speed, and there's a lot more evidence that supports what we presented in this entire presentation. So anyways, to me, with the understanding I have now, it's given me a tremendous sense of peace, because like so many other people who studied various aspects of consciousness, including all the doctors around the world who have had experiences with patients who have had near-death experiences or so-called mystical experiences, or these experiences, the savant syndrome and the like, they are all become believers. I know I had a conversation with Ken Ring, who was one of the early explorers in near-death experiences, and he interviewed a lot of blind people who had near-death experiences. And during their experience, their visual perceptual mechanisms came back, even though they've been blind since birth. And of course, physical science has no explanation for it. So he and many others, Bruce Grayson, Raymond Moody, and many others, are absolutely convinced that consciousness is not a byproduct of brain processes, but is way beyond the brain, and we exist in a sea of consciousness. So that concludes my presentation.